When my wife first brought up the idea of an open marriage, I was stunned. It wasn't out of the blue. Our relationship had been strained for a while, but it felt like a slap in the face. She said she wanted freedom, claimed I was too possessive, and told me that no one could own her. It hurt because I never saw our marriage as ownership. I saw it as a partnership. Her words made me question everything. Was I holding her back? Was I not enough? I tried to wrap my head around her request, but it didn't make sense to me. We had built a life together, shared dreams and plans for the future, and now it felt like she wanted to erase all of that. I couldn't figure out where I went wrong, or what I could have done differently to prevent this from happening. My mind replayed every argument, every moment of tension, and every time she seemed distant. I wondered if I had missed the signs or ignored her unhappiness for too long. The idea of an open marriage wasn't just uncomfortable, it was devastating. It went against everything I believed about love and commitment. To me, marriage was a promise to choose each other every day, through the good and the bad. But her words made it clear she didn't see it that way anymore. She didn't want to choose me, she wanted options. And that realization was like a knife to the heart. I spent weeks in a fog, overthinking every interaction we'd ever had. Her casual way of suggesting it made me feel like I didn't matter, like our years together weren't worth protecting. I tried to talk myself into understanding her perspective, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get past the betrayal I felt. It wasn't just the idea of her being with someone else, it was the fact that she could even suggest it in the first place. What hurt the most was how distant she had become. The woman who once looked at me with love and warmth now seemed cold and detached. It was as if she had already made up her mind and was just waiting for me to catch up. Every time I looked at her, I felt like I was staring at a stranger. I kept wondering if she had already started seeing someone else and was just laying the groundwork to justify her actions. Deep down, I sensed that her mind was already made up. This wasn't a request, it was a declaration. I felt powerless, like I'd lost control of the life we'd built together. It was as if the foundation of our marriage had crumbled, and I was the only one still trying to hold the pieces together. I wasn't sure if I could fix it, or if I even wanted to anymore. It didn't take long for her to act on her freedom. She started staying out late, claiming she was with friends. At first, I wanted to believe her. I clung to the hope that maybe I was overthinking things, that my fears were unfounded. But the signs were there, and they were impossible to ignore. The lies were thin and riddled with inconsistencies. She would leave the house dressed up, her excitement palpable, and return with a distant, almost indifferent attitude. It was as if the version of her that I once knew and loved had been replaced by someone I could barely recognize. Her phone became a constant companion, always in her hand or tucked away, as if she were guarding it from me. The buzzing notifications became more frequent, and I could see her smiling at messages she never bothered to share. That smile used to be for me, but now it felt like it was for someone else. A gut feeling told me what I didn't want to admit, that she had already stepped outside the bounds of our marriage. One night, my suspicions were confirmed. I saw a message light up her phone while she was in the shower. The name on the screen was obviously fake, but the tone of the message left no room for doubt. It was intimate, affectionate, and far too personal to be from a friend. My heart sank as I stared at the screen, a rush of anger and heartbreak overwhelming me. This was the confirmation I had dreaded but also needed. When I confronted her, I hoped for an apology, an ounce of regret, or even an attempt to explain. Instead, she didn't deny it. She simply looked at me with an unflinching expression and repeated the same line she had used before: "You don't own me." Her tone was cold and distant, devoid of the love and connection we once shared. That response crushed me more than the infidelity itself. It made me realize how far she had drifted, not just from me, but from the vows we had made to each other. It felt like she had already checked out of our marriage, and there was no turning back. Her detachment stung more than I thought it would. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and incredibly alone. I had spent so much time trying to save something she had already decided to let go of. That night, I sat in our empty living room, staring at the shadows on the wall, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. The person I thought I would spend my life with had turned into a stranger, and I couldn't see a way to fix it. After weeks of turmoil, I made the hardest decision of my life. I filed for divorce. It wasn't out of anger, though there was plenty of that. It was out of self-respect. I had reached a point where I realized I couldn't keep fighting for someone who had no intention of fighting for me. Staying in a marriage where I felt devalued, disregarded, and disrespected wasn't just painful, it was unsustainable. Filing for divorce felt like admitting defeat, and that thought haunted me. I had always believed in the sanctity of marriage, in working through problems and standing by your partner no matter what. But this wasn't something I could fix alone. She had already decided that our marriage wasn't enough for her, and no amount of effort on my part was going to change that. The vows we had taken, the promises we had made, they no longer held any weight for her. That realization was heartbreaking, but it was also clarifying. The process of divorce was every bit as brutal as I had feared. She didn't take it well, accusing me of being controlling and unreasonably jealous. She twisted the narrative, painting herself as the victim and me as the oppressive partner who couldn't let her be herself. It was painful to hear her say those things, especially knowing how much I had loved her and how hard I had tried to make things work. But even in the face of her accusations, I held my ground. I knew filing for divorce was the right choice, but that didn't make it easy. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I had given up too soon or if there was some way I could have salvaged our relationship. Those moments of self-doubt were the hardest to navigate. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the weight of my decision pressed down on me, I would replay our life together in my mind. I would think about the good times, the laughter, the love we once shared, and question whether I had done everything I could to save it. But every time I felt myself wavering, I reminded myself of the reality I had been living. I thought about the lies, the betrayal, and the cold detachment in her eyes when she told me I didn't own her. That wasn't love. That wasn't partnership. Walking away felt like tearing myself in two, but staying would have meant losing myself completely. For the first time in a long time, I chose myself. I chose to protect my heart and my future, even if it meant walking away from someone I had once believed I would love forever. The first year after the divorce was a roller coaster of emotions. At first, there was relief, a quiet but profound sense of freedom from the constant tension that had filled my marriage. But that relief was quickly followed by an avalanche of other feelings: anger, sadness, regret, and even moments of longing. Divorce isn't just the end of a relationship, it's the end of a life you imagine for yourself. I wasn't just mourning the loss of my wife, I was mourning the loss of the future I thought we'd share. There were nights when the emptiness hit me the hardest. I'd look around the house and see the remnants of a life we had built together. The photos, the little souvenirs from trips, even the furniture we had picked out as a couple, they all felt like ghosts of a life that no longer existed. Some nights I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right decision. What if I had tried harder? What if I had given her more time? These questions swirled in my mind, making it difficult to move on. Anger was another constant companion. I was angry at her for betraying me, for disrespecting our marriage, for making me feel like I wasn't enough. But I was also angry at myself for not seeing the signs sooner, for holding on too long, for allowing her actions to hurt me so deeply. It took time for me to accept that her choices were not a reflection of my worth. That realization didn't come easily, but when it did, it was like a weight had been lifted. Slowly, I began to piece my life back together. I realized that I had spent so much of my marriage trying to please her, trying to be what she needed, that I had forgotten who I was. Rebuilding my life wasn't just about finding new routines, it was about rediscovering myself. I started exploring hobbies I had neglected for years, reconnecting with friends, and even picking up new interests. It felt strange at first, but also liberating. One of the hardest but most important lessons I learned was that healing isn't linear. There were good days when I felt hopeful and excited about the future, and there were bad days when the pain of betrayal still cut deep. But with time, the good days began to outnumber the bad. I found strength in small victories, finishing a project, meeting new people, or even just enjoying a quiet evening without the weight of sadness hanging over me. That first year wasn't easy, but it taught me something invaluable: I could survive. And not just survive, I could rebuild. The life I had envisioned with her was gone, but that didn't mean my life was over. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I finally started putting myself first. A year after the divorce, I received a message from her. I hadn't expected it. By then, I had settled into my new life and was finally starting to feel like myself again. The message was simple: she wanted to talk. At first, I was hesitant. What could she possibly have to say after all this time? But curiosity got the better of me, and a part of me wanted closure. To hear her perspective now that the dust had settled. So, I agreed. When we met, it was surreal. She looked the same, but something about her felt different. She seemed smaller, less confident, almost unsure of herself. Her words came slowly, as if she were trying to piece together the right things to say. She admitted that the past year hadn't been what she thought it would be. The freedom she had craved, the excitement of exploring new relationships, hadn't brought her happiness. The men she pursued, the connections she sought, they had all been fleeting, shallow and empty. She said she missed the stability we had, the way I had loved her unconditionally, and the life we had shared. Her voice carried a hint of regret, and she even hinted at wanting to reconcile. Hearing her say those things should have made me feel validated, but instead, I felt nothing. I listened to her words, but they didn't stir the emotions they once would have. The pain she caused had fundamentally changed me, and while I could understand her regrets, I couldn't see myself ever going back. I told her the truth. I wished her well, but I had no desire to revisit the past. That chapter of my life was closed. It wasn't out of spite or bitterness I had let go of those feelings long ago. It was simply that I had moved on. The person I was when I loved her no longer existed, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. Walking away from that conversation, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. For the first time, I realized I was free not just from her, but from the weight of everything that had happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the doubts, they no longer defined me. They were part of my story, but they weren't the whole story. That encounter was a reminder of how far I had come. I had built a life for myself, one where I didn't have to question my worth or fight for someone's loyalty. I learned that love isn't about ownership or control, it's about mutual respect and trust. And when those things are broken, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away. I walked away from her and toward a future where I could finally be whole again.